The first time I suspected Daniel was cheating, I was folding his laundry on a Tuesday afternoon. The scent hit me before I could process what it meant. A perfume that wasn't mine, something floral and expensive, clinging to his dress shirt collar. I held the fabric to my nose and inhaled deeply, as if confirming a diagnosis. 17 years of marriage had taught me to recognize his smell, the sandalwood cologne I'd gifted him last Christmas, the faint trace of coffee that perpetually followed him. This wasn't his scent. This wasn't mine. I placed the shirt down carefully, smoothing the wrinkles with trembling hands. Some part of me had been waiting for this moment for years. The late nights at the office, the mysterious weekend conferences, the way his eyes no longer lingered on me when I entered a room. But suspicion is a far cry from evidence, and now I had something tangible in my hands. Our London townhouse suddenly felt too small, too stifling. Daniel and I had purchased it when Emma was just a baby, impressed by the Victorian moldings and the garden where I'd imagined our daughter playing. Now, Emma was 15, locked in her room with headphones and teenage angst, and I was standing in our bedroom holding the physical proof of my husband's betrayal. I finished folding the laundry. That's the part that still strikes me as odd, how I continued the mechanical movements of domestic life, even as my world tilted on its axis. Fold the sleeves in, then in half, then in thirds, place in the drawer, move to the next item. My mother would have approved of such composure. "A lady never makes a scene, Elizabeth," she'd always said, her Scottish brogue emphasizing each syllable as if engraving it into my brain. That evening, I prepared Daniel's favorite meal, beef Wellington with roasted potatoes and glazed carrots. I set the table with our wedding china, lit candles, and even put on the navy dress he once said brought out the blue in my eyes. Emma raised her eyebrows when she saw the spread, but said nothing before retreating back upstairs. She had her father's perceptiveness. "What's the occasion?" Daniel asked when he walked in, loosening his tie and kissing my cheek. A perfunctory gesture like signing a receipt. "No occasion," I replied, pouring him a glass of the Bordeaux we'd brought back from our 10th anniversary trip. Just felt like doing something nice. We ate in near silence, the clink of silverware against china filling the void where conversation should have been. I studied his face across the flickering candlelight, the gray threading through his dark hair, the laugh lines around his eyes that I used to believe I'd put there. He was still handsome at 47, in that distinguished way that men often become in middle age, while women are just considered old. "How was work?" I finally asked, cutting a piece of beef with surgical precision. "Busy. The Thompson account is proving more complicated than we anticipated." He didn't look up from his plate. He never did when he lied. "I see. And how's Sarah? Still having trouble with her divorce?" Sarah was his assistant, a woman I'd met precisely twice at company functions. Young, eager, with a laugh that carried across crowded rooms. His fork paused halfway to his mouth. "She's fine. Why do you ask?" "Just curious. Her perfume was on your shirt. The one you wore to Birmingham last week." The silence that followed was deafening. I took a sip of wine, savoring the bitter notes on my tongue. Waiting. 17 years deserved at least the dignity of a response. "Lizzie, it's not what you think." His voice had taken on that soothing tone he used with difficult clients. "What do I think, Daniel?" I set my glass down carefully, afraid I might crush it in my grip. It was just drinks after a stressful day. Nothing happened. I nodded, as if considering this explanation. "The thing is, I never mentioned Birmingham. You told me you were in Manchester last week." His expression changed then. The slight widening of eyes, the quick recalculation happening behind them. I'd caught him in a lie, and we both knew it. After a moment, he pushed his plate away and sighed. "I don't want to have this conversation with Emma in the house." Of course. Our daughter. The shield he'd used to deflect the moment, to buy time to construct better lies. I stood up, collecting our half-eaten meals. "You're right. This can wait." But it couldn't. Not really. The weight of unspoken truths was already crushing the air from my lungs. As I scraped expensive food into the bin, I realized with startling clarity that I didn't know this man anymore. This stranger who shared my bed, my home, my life, and perhaps I never truly had. 2 days passed in a strange dance of normalcy. Daniel left for work earlier than usual, came home later. We exchanged pleasantries like actors following a tired script. Emma noticed the tension. Children always do, regardless of how much we try to shield them, but said nothing, just watched us with those observant eyes that missed nothing. I spent those days in a state of numb efficiency, teaching my literature classes at the university as if discussing Austen and Bronte still mattered, smiling at colleagues who couldn't see the fractures spreading beneath my skin. During my office hours, I found myself staring at the framed photo on my desk. Daniel, Emma, and me at Brighton Beach 3 summers ago, the wind whipping my hair across my face as we all squinted into the sun. We looked happy. Maybe we were then. On the 3rd day, I did something I'd never imagined myself doing. I waited until Daniel left for work, then sat at his desk in our home office. His laptop password had been Emma's birthday for years. I typed it in, half expecting it to fail, but the screen unlocked immediately. Some part of me had hoped for that small barrier. Evidence that he'd tried to hide his betrayal more carefully would have somehow been less painful than this careless openness. I found the emails easily enough. They weren't even hidden in a separate folder. Sarah. Dozens of messages, arranging meetings in hotel rooms, not just in Birmingham, but in Edinburgh, Manchester, even Paris. A weekend he'd told me was a financial conference. The language between them was intimate, familiar. They discussed me occasionally. Poor Lizzie, so absorbed in her books and students. She hardly notices anything anymore. They'd been seeing each other for 11 months. My hands hovered over the keyboard. I could delete the emails. I could forward them all to myself as evidence. I could reply to Sarah, woman to woman, and ask her what she saw in my husband that was worth destroying a family for. In the end, I did nothing. I simply logged out and closed the laptop, feeling oddly hollow. Later that afternoon, I visited my mother at the care home in Kensington. At 84, dementia had erased much of her sharp edges, leaving behind a softer version of the strict woman who'd raised me. I sat beside her bed, holding her thin hand while she drifted in and out of lucidity. "You look troubled, Elizabeth," she said during a clear moment, her Scottish accent thicker than it had been in decades. "I'm fine, Mom. Rubbish. I've known you since before you drew breath. What's happened?" I hesitated, then found myself telling her everything. The perfume, the emails, the weight of betrayal sitting heavy on my chest. She listened without interruption, her roomy eyes fixed on my face. "Your father did the same to me, you know," she said when I finished, matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. I stared at her, stunned. "Dad cheated on you?" 3 times that I knew of. The last was with his secretary. How terribly cliché. She patted my hand. I stayed because that's what women of my generation did. We endured. "Why didn't you ever tell me? What good would it have done? You adored him." She paused, struggling to find words through the fog of her condition. "But you're not me, Elizabeth. You don't have to endure." On the tube ride home, my mother's words echoed in my mind. I thought about generational patterns, about the quiet suffering of women, about the weight of expectations we carry. My mother had stayed with my father until his death, maintaining the perfect image of a family while harboring her pain in silence. I'd inherited her stoicism, her tendency to smooth over difficulties rather than confront them. But I'd also been raised in a different world, with different possibilities. When I arrived home, the house was empty. A note on the refrigerator in Emma's handwriting informed me she was staying at her friend Priya's house for a study session. Daniel had texted that he would be working late. Again. I wandered through the quiet rooms, touching familiar objects, the vase we'd bought in Crete, the throw pillows I'd hand-embroidered during my nesting phase before Emma was born, the framed first edition of Pride and Prejudice Daniel had given me for our 5th anniversary. In our bedroom, I opened his side of the closet and ran my fingers along his suits, arranged by color and season. I knew each one, when he'd bought it, which events he'd worn it to. 17 years of shared history hanging neatly on wooden hangers. Behind his winter coats, I found a small leather case I didn't recognize. Inside was a platinum bracelet with a single charm, a tiny Eiffel Tower. The receipt was still tucked in the velvet lining, purchased 3 months ago, not from any jewelry store in London, but from a boutique in Paris. Not for me, certainly. My birthday had been last month, marked by a hasty card and a generic bouquet ordered online. I closed the case and returned it exactly where I'd found it, then sat on the edge of our bed, suddenly exhausted. The evidence kept mounting, each discovery another stone on my chest. But beneath the pain, something else was emerging. A quiet, steady anger, and with it, clarity. I knew what I had to do. I chose a Thursday evening for the confrontation. Emma would be at her weekly orchestra practice until 9. She played cello with a passion that sometimes made me envious. How long had it been since I'd felt that kind of intensity about anything? I prepared a simple dinner. Nothing elaborate like the night I'd first mentioned the perfume. Just pasta with the pesto Daniel preferred. I wasn't trying to sweeten the moment this time. I poured myself a glass of wine and waited at the kitchen table, the manila folder containing printed copies of his emails with Sarah placed precisely in front of the chair where he always sat. When he walked in at 7:30, he seemed distracted, loosening his tie and checking his phone. He kissed my cheek automatically before noticing the folder. "What's this?" "Sit down, Daniel." Something in my tone must have alerted him. He hesitated, then lowered himself into the chair, leaving the folder untouched. "I know about Sarah," I said quietly. "I know about Birmingham, Manchester, Edinburgh. I know about Paris." His face performed a series of micro-expressions: surprise, denial, calculation, and finally, resignation. He opened the folder and flipped through the first few pages of emails I'd printed, then closed it again. "You went through my computer." His voice was flat, neither accusatory nor apologetic. "Yes. I never meant for this to happen, Lizzie." I'd expected those exact words, that exact tone, regretful but with a subtle undercurrent suggesting inevitability, as if the affair had been a force of nature rather than a series of deliberate choices. I'd rehearsed this conversation in my mind countless times over the past few days, imagining his excuses, my responses. Yet now that the moment had arrived, I felt oddly calm. "When did we stop being enough for you?" I asked, genuinely curious. Was there a specific moment, or was it gradual? He sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so familiar it made my heart ache despite everything. "It's not that simple. You and I, we've been coexisting. When was the last time we really talked? Not about Emma or bills or schedules, but really talked. So this is my fault? I didn't provide enough stimulating conversation, so naturally you had to sleep with your assistant. That's not what I'm saying." He leaned forward. "We both checked out of this marriage years ago, Lizzie. You with your books and students, me with work. Sarah was... She made me feel seen again." I took a sip of wine, letting the bitterness coat my tongue. Seen. That's interesting terminology for an affair that's been going on while I've been sitting right here, making your dinner, washing your clothes, raising your daughter. Our daughter, he corrected automatically. Yes, our daughter, who, by the way, deserves better than this. He had the decency to look ashamed then. I never wanted to hurt either of you. And yet, here we are. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at our small garden where spring bulbs were just beginning to emerge. I spoke to my mother the other day. "Did you know my father cheated on her multiple times during their marriage?" Daniel remained silent. She stayed because that's what women of her generation did. They endured. I turned to face him. "I've been wondering if that's what I've been doing these past few years. Enduring. Making excuses for your absences, both physical and emotional. Pretending not to notice when you pulled away. What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want to endure anymore, Daniel. I want more than this half-life we've been living." His expression shifted, panic replacing the resignation. "Are you talking about divorce?" The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implication. I realized I hadn't actually decided yet. Part of me, the practical part, tallied up the complications. The house, finances, Emma's well-being. Another part, the wounded part, wanted to hurt him as deeply as he'd hurt me. But beneath both was something else entirely. A quiet longing for authenticity I hadn't felt in years. "I don't know yet," I answered honestly. "But I do know I can't continue like this. I'll end it with Sarah," he said quickly. "I'll change. We can go to counseling." I studied his face, the face I'd woken up beside for nearly 2 decades. I used to know every expression, every micro movement. Now he seemed like a stranger, or worse, like someone I'd once known intimately who had transformed into someone unrecognizable. "Why did you buy her that bracelet? The one with the Eiffel Tower charm?" His eyes widened slightly. I'd caught him off guard again. "How did you—" "It doesn't matter. What matters is you spent our money on expensive jewelry for another woman, while I got flowers ordered online for my birthday. What matters is you took her to Paris, a city I've been asking to visit for years, and created memories with her in places I've only dreamed of seeing. I'm sorry," he whispered, and for the first time that evening he seemed genuinely remorseful. "I believe you're sorry you got caught," I replied. "But that's not the same as being sorry for the betrayal itself." We sat in silence for several long moments. Outside, a light rain began to fall, tapping gently against the window panes. I thought about Emma, playing her cello across town, unaware that her family was fracturing. I thought about Sarah, waiting somewhere for Daniel to call or text. I thought about my mother in her care home, carrying the weight of my father's betrayals to her grave. Finally, I spoke again. "I need time to think about what I want, about what's best for Emma. I think you should stay with your brother for a while. Lizzie, please, Daniel, if you respect me at all, give me this space." He looked like he wanted to argue, but instead nodded slowly. "How long?" "I don't know. As long as it takes." As he stood to leave, he hesitated, then asked, "Do you think you can ever forgive me?" I met his gaze steadily. "I don't know that either. But I do know that whatever happens next, I won't be defined by your choices, only by my own." The house felt different with Daniel gone, larger somehow, yet emptier. Emma noticed his absence immediately when she returned from orchestra practice that Thursday night. I watched her eyes dart to his empty chair at breakfast the next morning, questions forming but remaining unasked. "Your father's staying with Uncle James for a while," I finally said, pushing a plate of scrambled eggs toward her. "We need some space to figure things out." She nodded slowly, processing. At 15, Emma had the uncanny ability to hear what wasn't being said. "Is this about the perfume on his shirt?" I noticed it too. My hand froze midway to my teacup. "You knew?" She shrugged, eyes downcast. "I'm not a child, Mum. I've seen how he looks at his phone when it buzzes, how he takes calls in another room." She stabbed at her eggs with unnecessary force. "And I've seen how you pretend not to notice." The shame that washed over me was unexpected. Had I been so transparent in my willful blindness? Had my daughter been watching me ignore what was happening right in front of me? "I'm sorry, Emma. I didn't mean for you to be caught in the middle of this." "I'm not in the middle," she said firmly. "I'm on your side." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand, throat tight with emotion. We finished breakfast in silence, but it was a different quality of silence than before, honest rather than strained. The following weeks unfolded in a strange new rhythm. Daniel collected some of his things while Emma and I were out shopping. He called every evening to speak with her, their conversations short and awkward. He texted me about practical matters, bills, his mail, a leak in the garden shed, but never about us, never about what would happen next. I found myself both relieved and irritated by his distance. My mother's condition deteriorated rapidly that month. The doctors said it wasn't unusual with dementia, periods of stability followed by sudden decline. I visited her daily after my classes, sitting beside her bed while she drifted between clarity and confusion. During one lucid moment, she grasped my hand with surprising strength. "Have you left him yet?" she asked. "We're separated. He's staying with his brother." She nodded approvingly. "Good. You've always been stronger than me." "I don't feel strong, Mom." "Strength isn't about feeling, Elizabeth. It's about doing what needs to be done despite the fear." Her eyes, cloudy with age, fixed on mine with startling clarity. "Promise me you won't waste years like I did, waiting for a man to become worthy of you." 3 days later, she slipped away peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was small, a few of her remaining friends, some colleagues from the school where she'd taught mathematics for 40 years. Emma in her first black dress, solemn and tall beyond her years. Daniel came too, standing slightly apart from us at the graveside, his presence both a comfort and an intrusion. Afterward, he approached me cautiously. "I'm so sorry about your mother, Lizzie. I know how close you were. Thank you for coming. I replied formally. It meant a lot to Emma. And to you? I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in weeks. He seemed thinner, with new lines around his eyes. Was he suffering too in his brother's spare room? Had Sarah provided the comfort he sought? I don't know what means something to me anymore, I answered honestly. Everything feels recalibrated. He nodded as if he understood, though I doubted he did. Can we talk sometime? About us? About what happens next? The question hung between us like a tangible thing. In the past, I would have immediately agreed, eager to smooth over difficulties, to return to the comfort of routine. But my mother's words echoed in my mind. Don't waste years waiting for a man to become worthy of you. Not yet, I said. I'm still finding my footing. That night, after Emma had gone to bed, I sat in my mother's old rocking chair that I'd brought home from the care facility. I'd found her journal while clearing out her room. A simple leather-bound book filled with her neat handwriting. I hadn't known she kept one. I opened it randomly to an entry from 1992, the year my father had his final affair. I saw them today, walking arm in arm down Regent Street, she'd written. He didn't see me. I stood frozen, watching them laugh together, wondering if he ever laughed that freely with me anymore. The pain was physical, like a stone lodged beneath my ribs. Yet beneath the pain was something else, a flicker of envy, not for her youth or beauty, but for her freedom. She makes choices I never allowed myself to consider. I closed the journal, tears blurring my vision. My stoic, proper mother, who had never shown vulnerability, had felt everything so deeply. She had stayed with my father until his death, maintaining the perfect facade while carrying this private pain. I realized with startling clarity that I'd been following the same path, confusing endurance with strength, silence with dignity. That night, I wrote my own journal entry, the first of what would become many. Today, I buried my mother and faced my husband. One journey ended, another continues. I don't know yet where it leads, but for the first time, I'm allowing myself to consider all possible destinations. Spring gave way to summer, bringing unseasonably warm days that left London sticky and restless. 2 months had passed since Daniel moved out. 2 months of adjusting to a half-empty closet, to cooking smaller meals, to the absence of his steady breathing beside me at night. I'd expected to feel adrift without the familiar shores of my marriage, but instead found myself strangely anchored, tethered to something essential within myself that had been submerged for years. My colleague Catherine noticed the change first. We were having lunch in the university courtyard, discussing the upcoming semester, when she suddenly set down her fork and studied me intently. "There's something different about you, Lizzie," she said. "You seem, I don't know, more present somehow." I laughed. "I've always been present." "No, you haven't," she countered gently. "For years, you've been physically here but mentally elsewhere, like you were always calculating something. What to make for dinner, whether you'd said the right thing to Daniel, if Emma had everything she needed. But now," she gestured vaguely, "now you're actually here." Her observation lingered with me for days afterward. Had I really been so absent from my own life, so consumed with maintaining the appearance of perfect wife and mother, that I'd disappeared beneath the roles? I thought of all the faculty gatherings I'd left early to prepare Daniel's dinner, the research opportunities I'd declined because they conflicted with his schedule, the writing I'd abandoned because domestic life demanded my full attention. One evening, while Emma was at a friend's house for a weekend sleepover, I found myself standing in our spare room, a space that had become a repository for abandoned projects and forgotten ambitions. In one corner sat boxes of research notes for a book on female characters in Gothic literature I'd started before Emma was born. In another, canvases from the painting phase I'd briefly embraced in my 30s, before convincing myself I had no real talent. I spent the night sorting through these artifacts of discarded passions, rediscovering pieces of myself I'd packed away. By morning, I'd cleared the room completely, leaving only my old writing desk by the window, and a single blank canvas on an easel. When Daniel called that Sunday to arrange picking up more of his things, I found myself inviting him for tea instead. He arrived looking uncertain, hovering in the entryway of what had been our shared home, as if waiting for permission to fully enter. "You've rearranged things," he observed, noticing the absence of his favorite armchair, which I'd moved to the spare room. My new study. I've made some changes, I agreed, pouring tea into cups that had been wedding gifts. It felt necessary. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the silence between us no longer charged with unspoken accusations, but instead filled with a strange new formality. "How's Emma adjusting?" he asked. "She misses you," I said honestly. "But she's resilient. She started writing songs. Did she tell you? Lyrics to go with her cello compositions." Pride flickered across his face. "She hasn't mentioned it. We mostly talk about school when I see her." Another silence stretched between us. I studied him openly, noting the new casualness in his dress, the uncertainty in his posture. He looked smaller somehow, less substantial without the frame of our marriage to define him. "Are you still seeing Sarah?" I asked, surprising myself with the directness of the question. He flinched slightly but met my gaze. "No. It ended a few weeks after I left." He hesitated. It wasn't what I thought it would be." I nodded, unsurprised. "Affairs rarely are," I imagined. "Why did you do it, Daniel?" "Really? Not the excuses about us growing apart or me being distant. The actual reason." He stared into his tea for a long moment. "I think I was afraid," he finally said. "Of aging, of irrelevance. Sarah made me feel important, desired, like I still mattered." "You mattered here," I said quietly. "You mattered to Emma and me. I know that now." He looked up, his eyes heavy with regret. "I've been seeing someone, a therapist. He's helping me understand why I sabotaged the life we built." I absorbed this information, surprised by the absence of anger I'd expected to feel. Instead, there was only a gentle sadness for the man sitting across from me, a man I'd loved for nearly 2 decades, the father of my child, someone I now realized I barely knew. "I've started writing again," I told him, "and painting. I've turned the spare room into a studio of sorts." His eyebrows raised slightly. "The book on Gothic literature?" The fact that he remembered caught me off guard. "Yes, actually. You should finish it, Lizzie. You always had important things to say." Something shifted between us in that moment. A recognition, perhaps, that we were becoming different people apart than we had been together. There was a freedom in that realization, alongside the grief. After he left, I went to my new study and sat at the desk, looking out at the garden where early evening light gilded the edges of leaves and flowers. I opened my laptop and began to write. Not the academic analysis I'd planned years ago, but something more personal, more urgent. Words flowed with surprising ease, filling the screen with reflections on marriage, betrayal, and the quiet reclamation of self. My phone buzzed with a text from Catherine, inviting me to join her and some colleagues for dinner at a new restaurant in Covent Garden. In the past, I would have declined, citing family obligations. Instead, I wrote back, "I'd love to. What time?" As I got ready to go out, I caught sight of myself in the mirror, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with purpose. Catherine was right. Something had changed. I was present now, inhabiting my own life with a fullness I hadn't experienced in years. The realization didn't erase the pain of Daniel's betrayal or the uncertainty of our future, but it offered something I hadn't expected to find in the aftermath of heartbreak: possibility. Autumn arrived with its characteristic crispness, painting London in amber and gold. Emma had started her final year of secondary school, suddenly focused on university applications and future plans. Our evenings were often spent at the kitchen table, mugs of tea growing cold as we discussed English literature programs and the merits of staying in London versus adventure elsewhere. I recognized in her a restlessness I'd once possessed at her age, before marriage, before compromise had calcified into habit. "Would you mind terribly if I went somewhere far away?" she asked one evening, biting her lip. "Like Edinburgh, or even abroad?" "I'd miss you desperately," I admitted. "But I'd mind more if you stayed somewhere just for my sake." She seemed relieved, as if she'd been carrying this worry for some time. "Dad thinks I should stay close to home. He says families should stick together, especially now." I chose my words carefully. "Your father and I want different things for you, it seems. I want you to build a life that makes you happy, not one that makes us comfortable." She nodded thoughtfully, then asked the question I'd been dreading. "Are you and Dad getting divorced?" The word still caused a small flinch, even after months of separation. We're moving in that direction, yes. We've both engaged solicitors. Because of Sarah? Partly, I acknowledged. But also because we've become different people than the ones who married each other. Sometimes relationships complete their natural course. She absorbed this with the seriousness particular to teenagers confronting adult complexities. Will you be okay? Financially and everything? I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. I'll be more than okay. I've been offered a position as department chair next year, and my book proposal was accepted by Cambridge University Press last week. Her face brightened. Mum, that's brilliant. Why didn't you say anything? I'm telling you now. I smiled. I'm learning to celebrate my own victories, not just everyone else's. 2 weeks later, I had an unexpected encounter that tested this new philosophy. I was meeting my publisher for lunch at a small Italian restaurant near Charing Cross when I saw her, Sarah, seated alone at a corner table, absently stirring a cup of coffee. I recognized her immediately from the company functions, though we'd barely spoken. She was lovely in a conventional way, slim, blonde, perhaps 30, young enough to make me feel ancient at 45, yet old enough to know better than to become involved with a married man. My first impulse was to leave before she noticed me. My second, more visceral urge was to confront her, to demand explanations for the pain she'd participated in causing. I did neither. Instead, I followed the hostess to my table, which unfortunately provided a clear view of Sarah across the restaurant. She looked up as I passed, recognition dawning in her eyes, followed immediately by panic. She half rose, as if to flee, then seemed to think better of it, and sank back into her seat. Our eyes met briefly before I deliberately turned away to greet my publisher, a cheerful woman in her 60s who was already ordering wine for us both. Throughout lunch, I was acutely aware of Sarah's presence, though I kept my back to her table. I focused intently on our discussion of publication timelines and marketing strategies, surprising myself with my own assertiveness as I negotiated for better terms. When my publisher excused herself to take a phone call, I found myself alone, suddenly tempted to glance in Sarah's direction. Before I could decide, a shadow fell across my table. Mrs. Harrington? Sarah said, her voice smaller than I remembered. I was just leaving, but I felt I should say something. I looked up at her. This woman who had featured so prominently in the collapse of my marriage, yet remained essentially a stranger to me. Up close, she seemed less confident than I'd imagined, nervously twisting a ring on her right hand. Please sit, I heard myself say. Just for a moment. She hesitated, then slid into the chair opposite me. I want to apologize, she began, though I know that's inadequate. Why did it end? I asked, curious despite myself. Daniel mentioned it was over. Surprise flickered across her face. He told you? I suppose that's something. She sighed. It ended because reality caught up with fantasy. He wasn't who I thought he was when he was just my boss, my obsession, I suppose. And who was he? Sad, she said simply. Deeply, irreparably sad, and determined to blame everyone else for that sadness. His demanding wife, his rebellious daughter, his unappreciative colleagues. Eventually, he started blaming me, too. I absorbed this assessment of the man I'd spent 17 years with, surprised by how accurately it resonated. Had Daniel always been this way? Or had he changed gradually over time? Had I been too close to see it clearly? I truly am sorry, Sarah continued. I knew he was married. I knew about you and Emma. There's no excuse. I studied her, this woman I'd imagined as a villain in my personal tragedy. She was just a person, flawed, complicated, capable of terrible choices and genuine remorse. In some strange way, seeing her humanity made my own path forward clearer. We all make mistakes, I said finally. The question is what we learn from them. She nodded, relief visible in the softening of her shoulders. I've accepted a position with another firm, in Manchester. I'm leaving London next week. Good luck, I said, meaning it. I hope you find what you're looking for. After she left, my publisher returned, eyebrows raised questioningly. Friend of yours? I considered the question. No, I replied. just someone I needed to meet properly. That evening, I received an email from Daniel's solicitor with the first draft of our divorce agreement. I read it carefully at my desk. The terms laid out in clinical language that reduced 17 years to assets and liabilities, custody arrangements, and financial settlements. It should have felt devastating. Instead, there was a strange sense of completion, like finishing a difficult but necessary book. I thought about Sarah's description of Daniel, deeply, irreparably sad. I thought about my mother's journal entries, documenting a lifetime of compromises. I thought about Emma, poised to begin her own journey, watching and learning from the choices I made now. Outside my window, leaves spiraled down from the plane tree in my garden, their descent beautiful in its inevitability. Some endings are like that, I realized. Not tragic, just necessary for what comes next. I closed the document and opened a new one, beginning the next chapter of my reclaimed life with steady fingers and a surprisingly light heart.